All right. Good. Is this on? Yeah. Good morning. My name is Mickey Weiner. I'm the president of Impact Fashion, and we are thrilled to be hosting the Future of Fashion, a policy roundtable discussion. Our club's mission is to help raise awareness, to reshape the current fashion system towards a sustainable fashion future, to inspire new thinking, and to provide students with opportunities to learn from and connect with leading industry professionals and organizations. In line with our club's mission, today's panel centers on the dynamic policy landscape and how it might shape the future of fashion at both the the domestic and the global level. In addition to today's panel, our club has some exciting events coming up. If you are an SPS member, please check them out and engage. And now I would like to pass it over to Caroline Levine, our Director of Events, to introduce the panel.
Hello. Hi, everyone. I'm so excited to introduce to you our dynamic roster of panelists today, each one representing a different facet of the industry to facilitate a well-rounded roundtable discussion that shapes multiple perspectives on fashion policy. We have Dana Davis, the Vice President of Sustainability, Product, and Business Strategy at Hoffman, Cassell, Ferere, an editorial contributor for Forbes, and editor-in-chief and founder of Page Magazine. We also have two SUMA alumni, Devon Rufo, senior sustainability expert of fashion and sporting goods at Quantis, and Becca Coughlan, the senior accountability manager at Remake. And last but not least, we have the brilliant Elizabeth Cline, author and lecturer at Columbia University, who will moderate our panel. Thank you, everybody. Enjoy.
Hello, everybody. I am really excited for this conversation. It's good to see a lot of familiar faces out in the audience, a lot of current and former students, Impact Fashion members. And I'm really excited to see all of the panelists here today. And yeah, we have a lot to cover. So I'm gonna stop dragging this out and really get into it. So the fashion industry, a lot of people may not connect it to policy conversations, but it really, if you think about it, it's been driving, galvanizing massive changes in how we organize and regulate society for over 150 years, starting with the abolition of slavery. And if you look at the first labor laws in the United States, a lot of those were inspired by organizing by garment workers in New York City and Chicago. And then if we bring it up to a little bit more modern day, even the modern environmental movement and the kind of public outrage around DDT, that was very connected to the cotton industry. So these connections, they're deep, they're historic, they've been going on for a long time. And even today, the fashion industry is once again driving some of the most dynamic policy conversations in the United States and in the EU and globally. We were just chatting backstage about everything that's going on. Our challenge today is in focusing and narrowing it down because there's a lot happening with regulation. In the United States, we have the Fashion Act in New York State, the Fabric Act, California Garment Worker Protection Act, the Uyghur Forced Labor Prevention Act. And then Devon is graciously going to walk us through some of what's going on in the EU because there's a lot going on there as well. And don't worry, if you are new to this conversation, we are promised to try not to talk too much in acronyms and really kind of break down what's going on because it really is exciting. So Becca and Cassell, am I pronouncing that correctly? Cassell? Yeah. Let's bring the conversation to today. What are the environmental and social issues in the modern day fashion industry? Like, what are the ones that are the industry sort of the main ones that the industry is grappling with? And how and why are they driving this policy conversation? So Becca, I'll start with you and then we'll go over to Cassell.
Cool, thank you. I think that the modern day fashion industry is really grappling with many of the same social and environmental issues that it has always grappled with, those to do with colonialism, subjugation, and exploitation of women, people of color, immigrant communities and communities in the global south, etc. for the enrichment of a small few, namely white men. So that's, poor labor conditions, a lack of living wages, and then environmental degradation. For the last 150 years, fashion companies have repeatedly chased lower and lower wages and less and less regulation from country to country, from North America to South America to Western and Eastern Europe and Asia and Africa. I was in a call yesterday where someone said, we've been dealing with sweatshops since we invented the sewing machine, which I thought was really apt. I think today a lot of these issues are exacerbated by the absolute scale of our global population, by globalization and production and the convergence of, in recent history, really unprecedented crises like the pandemic and the climate crisis. And so throughout history, we've really only seen, as Elizabeth alluded to, progress come out of tragedy. So the Triangle Shirtwaist Factory fire here in New York sort of birthed the labor movement and improved labor standards here. The collapse of the Rana Plaza garment factory in Bangladesh in 2013, we saw a binding agreement, the International Accord, come out of that. And so I think we're at a stage where there have been 30 plus years of voluntary CSR efforts in the fashion industry that have failed, and we are slowly realizing that we can't really consciously consume or buy our way out of the climate crisis, and that systemic change will not happen organically, or certainly not at the rate that we need it to. And so we really need policy and legislation to get us across the finish line of so many of these global goals and targets.
You mind just repeating it? I definitely don't have that much detail in me right now.
Yeah. Well, and I think, you're here kind of speaking as the media voice, and also I know you travel a lot and just really have your finger on the pulse of what's going on in the fashion industry. But what do you think the kind of main social and environmental issues are that the industry is grappling with right now?
I think one of the things, and to speak to what Becca said, is there's a global disconnect, I think, in the system. That's the reason why New York Fashion Act, trying to figure out where the supply chains are coming up from a lot of brands. There's the same reasons why there's inequality in pay around the world, and even in California, not just in Bangladesh and with the SB 62. So what I've seen globally, even they're ripping away forests to create more agricultural land and create more, cotton fields and things like that. Those type of things I've seen. They're so individual around the world because everyone is seeking a profit in some sort of way that they kind of, act on their own, but they kind of hinder the whole system entirely. So for me, the idea is to collectively come together with kind of standards, base standards that would essentially, inhibit everyone else to do the right thing in the process. So it's a very complex kind of approach, but from what I've seen, it's like when I go to Copenhagen or when I go to Sweden, and how the things down to their conferences, their fashion weeks, the fashion industry there is so based on an aesthetic of circularity, or something is built in already, and if it's not, they'll find a way to build it in, and then they'll cut back where necessary. So when I travel and I go to the Nordic, Scandinavia, it's a great example. I won't say perfect, but it's a great example of how coming together as an industry, you can really work on how circular your economy is when it comes to things like waste and finance and all those other things, policy as well.
Yeah, and so, one of the things I'm hearing is how globalization has changed this conversation. One, it makes it more challenging to design effective policies because you're having to design something that works across borders and works down very complex, large supply chains. But the issues have not changed really since the origins of industrial capitalism. And also the policy landscape and attitude is so different in the U.S. Versus Asia versus Europe. And Devon, I want to bring you into the conversation. And maybe you can connect it, because I know that you actually work directly with big companies who are trying to get ready and prepare for regulations. I think you were telling me, and I don't want to force the answer in a certain direction, but you're seeing a lot of reaction from big companies to things that are coming at them from the EU landscape. But what policies are you seeing fashion brands react to right now in your work?
Yeah. I'm seeing quite a few brands react to two policies in particular in the EU. One, the ESPR, which is basically an extended producer responsibility policy and eco-design directive. And so that builds upon an eco-design directive that was instated in 2009, which then brings financial incentives and taxation at a per garment level for the incorporation of recycled materials and preferred fibers into garments, for investment in intrinsic durability, which is the actual like product and textile durability, right, as well as extrinsic durability, which speaks to the emotional lifespan of a product, right? So is a product more trend-driven and seasonal? Is it more classic and intended to be incorporated into your wardrobe over time? And obviously there's recommendations like you increase durability if it's a classic product, right? Whereas you really want to design for recycling if it's something that's like trend and fad-driven, where we come into monomateriality, right? And so there are directives. I mean, the ESPR also rewards companies for investing in waterless dyeing methods, right, in their processing. So there are things in materials, product circularity, durability, and processing that are really driving brands forward in terms of, investing in eco-design. Another policy that's really major, it's coming out of France, the second version of the PEFCR, which is a policy that seeks to establish a standardized life cycle assessment method for not only textile products, but I believe there are now 29 categories of industrial products that would need to follow this standardized life cycle assessment in order to market products, right, for sustainability. And so I see a lot of brands reacting to that. Almost all of my clients, which range from about $1 billion in annual revenues up to like $6-7 billion mark, are now aggressively investing in LCA at scale, IT technology, tooling, cleaning up their data systems, upskilling their internal employees, so that they can actually meet the reward of being able to market their products sustainably, right, and be in compliance with like US green guides and also EU anti-greenwashing directives, right? But the beautiful thing that I think this unlocks from an eco-design perspective is that once you build LCA at scale infrastructure, right, designers, product development, production teams can actually make live decisions, right, to make like, they plug in all of the data from their fabrics, from their mills, from all of their manufacturers, and can literally export life cycle assessment scores, essentially, when making product decisions. So they can decide what fabrics they want to buy, where they want to make it. I think those are the coolest legislative packages I'm seeing from the EU.
Okay, and then I wrote down the policies before we came out here. So the PEFCR is the product environmental footprint category, and then in case anybody wants to do some additional reading, and then the eco-design for sustainable products regulation. And I just had a clarifying question. Are you seeing only European companies responding to this, and how is it influencing companies that are headquartered elsewhere?
Yeah, that's a great question because European companies are not the only ones. All of my clients are US-based companies, and all of them are reacting to these legislative packages, right? ESPR, for example. basically you have a 5 to 10 cent per garment additional tax if you don't incorporate recycled materials. And that's a ramp up over time from 2025 to 2030, where it goes like 15%, then 20, 25, et cetera. And if you do not comply with including recycled materials in your garments, you're paying for those. You're paying those taxes, right? So one of my clients, for example, $6 billion business. When you break it down, 20% of their products are sold in the European market, right? When you break that down financially, if they don't include recycled materials in those products, in any of those products, right, that's $5 to $10 million in taxes that they're going to have to pay for all of their products sold in Europe. And so that really helps drive the budget conversation within US-based companies, right? I believe the threshold is 100 million. You have to be above 100 million to pay these taxes. And yeah, so when companies are saying, okay, we don't have the budget to invest in sustainability, we don't have the budget for the teams, we don't have the budget to support, companies that are coming out with recycled textile remanufacturing, right? Suddenly there's budget, right? Because otherwise you have to face massive penalties.
Fines, yeah. And Dana, I want to pull you in here because Mara Hoffman, for anyone who's not aware, this is a company who was doing sustainability long before they were being forced to by regulators, pioneers in so many ways, in addition to making very beautiful clothes. And you guys are also interesting because in the U.S. context, over the past few years, we've had the California Garment Worker Protection Act that passed in 2021. Mara Hoffman supported that policy. And then now we have the New York Fashion Act winding its way through the state legislature, and then the Fabric Act on the federal level. And you all have been very vocal in supporting these laws that are not necessarily good for companies. They're I guess one way to look at it is they're imposing all these new rules and costs. But I wonder, where are you guys at with this conversation? What do you think these policies mean for the perspective of a brand or the industry? And is Mara Hoffman thinking of it differently just because you guys have been kind of doing sustainability for a while now?
Well, thank you for that. And hi, everyone. So I'm excited to speak from the brand perspective, and I'm speaking from a very different perspective than some of Devon's clients. So I think it's really important to understand that we are a very small company and we're a privately held company. So we're not held accountable to some of the same types of operations that exist in some of these large companies. We made this choice 10 years ago. We're a 24-year-old company, and we made these choices on our own. There wasn't conversation of policy at the time, and if there was, it wasn't being discussed in the fashion space. And I think that's something really important to understand, that policy hasn't been part of the conversation in fashion for a very long time. And so what I've seen a lot of brands trying to do is just even trying to understand how the policy actually works, what's the policy in the pipeline, what it means to their businesses. And the world of sustainability, unfortunately, has just been a place for people to kind of say, okay, yes, we're doing these things internally. Yes, we're checking these boxes, but in reality, we know that they're not really being held accountable. And so what we saw and why we leaned so heavily into policy was because this industry is not regulated, at all. There's no other industry of this size that is not regulated. And because the lack of regulation means that people are willing to act however they want. And we all know that everybody is basically at a race to the bottom line. And the way that the system is set up is for us to continue growing at crazy rates and focus on these insane amounts of profit. And as a business that has been trying to do the right thing, it's very hard because there's these constant blocks that you're up against, and there's no real data that exists in this industry. So if you're trying to set up systems to do things the right way, and you're bringing in your supply chain partners, and you're trying to actually report against this or ensure there's transparency in your supply chain, or all of these things that are required in some of the policy that's coming, it's really challenging unless you have the support and you have the buy-in from the big brands. So for us, we see it as an actual way to level the playing field, where it gives us the ability to actually keep doing the work that we're doing. About 5 years ago, we piloted our first program with a transparency software technology. And it was so hard. It is so hard, but at that time, it is so hard to bring these conversations to your suppliers and them actually want to support them, because they're like, well, nobody else is asking us to do this. And you know, because we're so small, we don't have a lot of leverage with these suppliers. And they're like, well, we're not going to invest our time and our resources into this. And even if we're willing to say, okay, but we're going to pay for implementation, we're going to give you all of the training, there's still no real buy-in from them, because it's not being required of them, or it's not even being asked by other brands. So for us, the reason why we're championing this and really getting behind it is, one, because it helps give us kind of our it helps lean into our strategy, right? So what are we focusing on? How are we going to get to operating in the most sustainable way that we see possible? And the policy gives us kind of a something to lean into for that. And it gives us a tool for conversation with others in the industry at this point, because we've seen that they're not going to take on these requirements on their own.
So I'm hearing leveling the playing field, and also, I mean, the transparency piece of it is super important. So the New York Fashion Act, for example, includes a lot of requirements on supply chain mapping. A surprising, shocking number of large apparel brands still do not publish a list of their suppliers. A lot of them still do not know their supply chain. So, you know, if you think about these ultra fast fashion companies that have come under a lot of criticism lately, like a Shein or Temu, you can imagine what kind of change would be forced just in saying you need to know where those 7,000 to 10,000 immediate direct suppliers you work with are located. And so there's the transparency piece of it. And then, you know, Devon has kind of talked about the life cycle assessment and like product design pieces of the conversation. And then Remake, coming back to you, Becca, you've been very heavily involved in the garment worker justice and the worker rights part of this conversation, which, as you said in your intro remarks, this is an issue that's been going on for a very long time. So Remake, you were involved in the passage of the California Garment Worker Protection Act, which, as I mentioned, Mara Hoffman was a supporter of, and now this has led to the Fabric Act on the federal level. Can you just tell us, like, what is the Fabric Act, and how would it change fashion, and what can you tell us about where it's at in Congress? What's going on with it?
Sure. So the Fabric Act, or the Fashioning, Accountability and Building Real Institutional Change Act, it's kind of a mouthful, but we love a good acronym, is a federal level bill which is hoping to raise labor standards for garment workers here in the United States. There are around 100,000 garment workers across the country producing everything from fast fashion for Ross, Fashion Nova, Forever 21 to slow responsible garments for brands like Mara Hoffman, as well as military fatigues. And the majority of these workers struggle to even earn a minimum wage because they earn something called piece rate pay. So this is a system by which workers earn by the garment sewn, and this is usually a couple of cents per seam or sleeve or what have you. And as you can imagine, then it becomes very difficult to take home even the minimum wage every day. And garment workers are forced to work very intensively with few breaks and really long overtime hours. So what the Fabric Act seeks to do is to set hourly pay in the garment industry and eliminate piece rate pay until the minimum wage is met. And so this would make the federal minimum wage the floor and not the ceiling for garment workers, and would leave workers better off, and also help, as Dana said, level the playing field for those companies already doing the right thing, as they would not necessarily be then competing with brands that are artificially squashing prices. The bill also introduces financial incentives for domestic apparel manufacturing improvements and workforce development to try and cement the US as the global leader in responsible apparel production. Since peak employment of 1.4 million garment workers in the US in the 70s, offshoring and outsourcing have really hollowed out the industry. And things like the pandemic, the Suez Canal crisis that we saw last year or the year before have really highlighted how important it is to have more local apparel production capabilities. And so the Fabric Act is also sort of complementary to trade policies such as the Uyghur Forced Labor Prevention Act and growing efforts to close trade loopholes that seek to address forced labor overseas and protect domestic production. And then finally, in addition to establishing a nationwide garment industry registry through the Department of Labor to promote transparency and accountability for manufacturers, the Fabric Act includes a provision to hold fashion brands and retailers alongside manufacturers jointly accountable for workplace wage violations. This kind of clause is relatively groundbreaking and super important, as it seeks to tackle the power imbalances that exist within fashion supply chains by incentivizing responsible production right from the top. Brands will no longer be able to feign ignorance or deny responsibility for what goes on in their supplier factories. And then in terms of where it's at, the bill was reintroduced last September by Senator Gillibrand and Representative Jerry Nadler. It has since garnered 9 co-sponsors in the Senate and 12 in the House, as well as over 350 endorsements from labor, civil society, and business. It sits in the Senate Help Committee, which deals with issues related to health, education, pensions, and labor. And so this bill is competing with a lot of other issues and a lot of other bills within this committee. And given that, and that, you know, it's an election year, there's a lot going on in the world, we are quite realistic about the fact that it's unlikely to pass this session, but that's not normal. Like, bills take years to pass. And so right now we're just really heavily focused on continuing to increase endorsements, particularly in red states and states where there are high levels of apparel manufacturing. We need to get bipartisan support. And yeah, so it's a process.
Yeah. Well, yeah, and I mean, as Devon was saying, it's interesting because even when, before laws even pass, companies start to prepare and shift behavior, and policy can kind of have this ripple effect just by being introduced. But I also understand that a lot of us live in the weeds of the policy conversation. So Cassell, I want to go back down to you. How are you seeing this policy conversation we're having impacting companies? Like, in general, are you seeing shifts in brands? Are you seeing sustainability, social justice, worker rights? Like, has it reached that kind of critical threshold as you're traveling and talking to people in the industry?
I think it's reached the next generation of fashion creators. They understand it more. They're willing to take more risk. I've seen some technology that, for me, whether it be something of a hardware, something of a software, or even something of a biotech, they're willing to kind of explore those areas. I think, they obviously are adhering to a lot of the newer policies. They're more aware of it. They don't have to kind of go back and do the research. It's given to them up front. So I think when it comes down to how the larger companies are operating, yes, they might do things that are very, minuscule in their operation. I think it just comes down to kind of infusing that newer tech into their system through these individuals. Policy-wise, it's very hard to kind of, I guess for these companies to kind of adapt in a way. But as you've seen over the years, like I think they've taken small steps, but I think in the right direction overall. It becomes a numbers game, like a very small percentage. But like I said, even if you think about the scale of fashion today, there's I haven't done the number, but I'm sure there's like 1,000 brands out there, but like everyone is doing something individually, but then something that can collectively be, very effective on a larger scale. So I'm just seeing a pocket of people doing something here, a pocket of people doing something there, and then ultimately what Google does. If you got new tech, they'll buy you out. You know what I mean? So I think, it'll be a reach back to those individuals to kind of get these bigger brands onto the new policies and things like that.
Yeah, I agree with you. There's like a lot of like bottom up generational change now happening where sustainability is of course like being normalized, and then it does feel like we're reaching a tipping point. And Devon, I want to come back to you because I find it really interesting, in the United States, like anything to do with environmental issues is like incredibly partisan and polarized. And I find it fascinating that in the EU, they've managed to agree on what a sustainable thing is. Can you talk more about what these standards are in the EU and like how a sustainable piece of fashion is defined? Like maybe you could describe a little bit more. You were talking about durability, but what else are lawmakers saying makes up this like ideal sustainable garment?
Yeah, that's a great question. There's a ton of complexity to that answer. If you look through,
just in the time allotted.
Yeah, totally. No. I'll do my best. For the ESPR regulation, I mean, there's hundreds of pages with levers for so many different things, right? But you're looking at, materials processing, durability, preferred materials, recycled materials. That's, really looking at things from a pure eco-design perspective and is giving companies many different options, right, for like how they play in the space. I talked a lot about the taxation, but there are also incentives, right? So if you're a future leader, right, if you were a Mara Hoffman and you were at that $100 million threshold, right, as a company, you would receive incentives, tax reductions, right, on the import fees going into the EU for incorporating all of these things, whereas, some of the laggards are the ones who are paying those tax increases, right? I think it's really challenging to define and measure all of these things. I know we were going to try to touch on France's new taxation, right, for fast fashion. How do you define a fast fashion garment? The tax ranges are going from €5 to €10, depending on the durability score, right? Depending on the use of recycled materials, depending on, if the as you were saying upstairs, right, the scale of a company, right? So like how many products they're selling per season, what they're actually churning out. And so all of these things are being looked at as different decision-making factors to define a sustainable product, to define a fast fashion product. And they're both developing legislation, by the way. So none of this is like fully passed yet, right? So like using PEFCR, as I was talking about, to actually measure a durability score, to actually measure the life cycle footprint of a product is required to then proceed with ESPR directives, right? To understand whether a company gets incentivized or taxed. And we're not quite there yet.
Yeah, no, it is complicated, and we're figuring it out in real time, like what makes an appropriate life cycle assessment. And I know that that's being contested in the EU, like what what measurement should be included and what's getting left out. And, you bring up, how many of you read about France trying to pass this tax on ultra fast fashion this past week? So again, a reminder that I live in a bubble, but yeah, no, this was huge news in the sustainable fashion community. And what they're trying to do is levy a not insignificant tax. I think it's something like €5, €10 per garment. And they haven't defined the threshold. They're saying maybe it's going to be based on annual turnover. They're really trying to go after these Sheins and Temus of the world. But again, that is not something that's passed. Like many of these other policies we're talking about, it's something that has momentum. We're not really sure what the potential for it passing will be. But Dana, I want to bring it back to you because a lot of these laws, they're legislative fights right now. They're not reality, but they're changing the industry anyway. How are you seeing, or how do you think the industry should be preparing for regulation in the meantime? And then what's being left out? We've talked about so many different ideas, like garment worker wages are being addressed, LCA, transparency. What are the blind spots?
I think it's tricky in legislation because a lot of these policies are trying to encompass a lot of things when that makes passing legislation very challenging because there's always going to be people who are opposing it, who are out there lobbying against it and putting a lot of their resources actually into lobbying against it. And we're seeing that now. I think the thing that brands need to be doing is first understanding just the policy in general. But I think part of the thing that's getting really tricky right now is the definition of things. And we don't have common language and definitions in this industry. So when we speak about preferred materials, that looks very different depending on the brand that you're talking to. If you're telling me that sustainability is taking, recycled bottles and turning it into, recycled polyester, that's sustainable, we know now that that's not considered circularity and that's not sustainable. And so I understand that everybody is at different points in their journey. And, we always want to stay in a very positive place and encourage people no matter where they are, that they have to start this work. But I think part of it is really starting to come up with common language in the definitions. And if we can't do that as an industry as a whole, at least having those internal, so they're kind of your North Star, so you always have something to lean into that you're like, okay, well, this is how we define it. And it doesn't mean that that's going to stay the same, but it kind of gives you a place to start. It's been interesting because, again, like I said, watching this industry, my background is not in policy. I'm not a lawyer. I've been learning all of this since, I guess it was SB 62, which was that like 4 years ago now?
Time is an illusion.
I don't even know.
I think 2021.
And yeah. And that policy for us was extremely important because it directly impacted our supply chain partners in California. And we're like, okay, this is a problem that we see happening in our factories. And yes, you can't even imagine the shit that goes down in the factories here in the US. It is mind-boggling that they are still able to work on this piece rate that we talk, or that they are being locked inside of their facilities and working for many, many hours, and it happens here in this country. And so when this policy started to come into place, we were very, very supportive because we have the right manufacturing partners and we want to ensure that their businesses can grow. And that so we became very public about, we list all of our supply chain partners, right? So that if you're looking to build your brand and you want to work with the right partner, come work with our factories. We started leaning into certifications, and certifications, it gets tricky, but when you're a small brand, there's certain certifications that you have to lean into to ensure that your supply chain partners are being upheld to certain, again, rules. So the industry, then you have the UFLPA that passes. And
Uyghur Forced Labor Prevention Act.
Thank you. Sorry. And now we start seeing brands investing in internal teams and investing in actually gathering paperwork to ensure that their goods don't get held up by Customs Border Patrol. And we're like, oh, okay, so you're willing to put the money in when you know that there's chances of you losing your money. And we're like, okay, so this is where policy becomes so important, because if we're incentivizing people to do good, great. Hopefully people will partake. But if we're penalizing them for doing bad, we know that people are going to change. And we've seen this with other policy outside of fashion, and it works. And so for us, it's like, okay, we're going to do whatever we can as a brand. We've already been doing this due diligence. Now we're going to get behind it. We're going to be extremely open, and we're going to do all of the things we can to show other brands that you can do this work. You just need to, yes, there's an investment that's required, but making that investment at this point needs to be done. Otherwise, you're going to have to pay. So it's a tricky place, but what I feel right now, and I do get, I try to stay positive about, is that it's coming. I don't know at what level and how in-depth it will be and what it's going to look like, but there is definite policy coming. And so it will change the way that this industry is operating.
And I think it's easy to get frustrated that change isn't happening enough, quick enough, and we have to stay angry and frustrated. That's like a key role in making attitude to have in making change. But I mean, absolutely, this conversation would have been so different, and it was different just 3 or 4 years ago.
I just want to also say one thing, is that what some people don't understand is that brands are being given the chance to actually also help build the policy. So a lot of brands are being talked to by some of these policy builders about what do they want to see inside this. If there was, if the threshold was changed, or if there was different laws laid out, and they're being actually like taken to the table, and there's discussions being had. So it's not like this work is being done behind the scenes and brands aren't part of it. So that's the thing that isn't really talked about so much, that there's a lot of brands that are, whether they're opposing it, nobody's opposing it publicly either, which I think is very interesting. They're not outright saying we don't stand behind this policy.
They do it behind
closed doors. But they're allowed to sit at the table. So now is the opportunity to gather, read the policy, understand what's coming, so that then you could potentially be part of really forming this policy.
Yeah, and I think the California Extended Producer Responsibility law for textiles is a good example of that. That was withdrawn earlier this year, but my optimistic read on it is so everybody could kind of work on it together and reintroduce a stronger version of it. But Becca, returning to you, the Garment Worker Protection Act is something that passed. It's been in effect for several years. What's the impact of that law been, and what's kind of your lesson, or lessons to people working on these issues in terms of either the influence of a state law and how it can influence federal law? What's kind of been the takeaway from that?
Yeah, so to clarify, the Fabric Act was sort of molded on this bill that passed in California, SB 62, which was really a worker-written and worker-driven bill. And we're already seeing workers benefit there, and the playing field is leveling there. And so the Fabric Act aims to ensure that those same protections for workers and businesses are the same across the country. I think it's super interesting to look at, but I think state-level policy, it kind of can act as like a test case for federal policy, and here and elsewhere. I think of SB 62 and, some of the concerns and criticisms about it. You can kind of start to see what was valid, what were maybe red herrings. SB 62 was like lauded as like a job killer in California. And while it's still kind of early days and the data is still coming in, it doesn't really look like that's the case. And so you can kind of see what's working at a state level and then what's possible at other levels. I also think that even at the state level, it's sort of moving the conversation forward at the federal and international levels. Like, it's helping still to set minimum standards that are higher around the world, and just advancing the broader policy conversation. It's obviously a lot more difficult to pass a bill at the federal level. There is much more to contend with, many more stakeholders that need to be engaged and on board, across the aisle. And just, I think, like I said, like, these things can take years and years to pass. So I think it is also important to just like pat ourselves on the back as well for these small wins, that this is even a conversation that we're having. I mean, all of us here are educating different stakeholders, policymakers around the world on the issues that plague our industry and on what solutions are possible. And I think that's very, very cool.
Yeah, and then, I mean, to my knowledge, the joint and several liability language from SB 62 is now in the New York bill.
In the New York bill, yes.
Yeah,
in the
Fabric
Act. Yeah,
but
so that was huge.
Yeah, it's also interesting just to see how, even just certain pieces of policies can kind of have this ripple effect. And so, Cassell, returning back to you, you, as someone from the media, what advice do you have to those working in policy in terms of like how to communicate what we're doing, how to make these stories resonate more, or what do you think is missing in the conversation?
I think a lot of I would call it just practicality is missing in the conversation. There's a lot, like when I was explaining before how things are happening in these small pockets. There's no communication happening to the point where organizations can see a through line. They all care about their bottom line. I'm not opposed to profits and sustainability, but it's how we get there. And yeah, there's too many things happening on their own. There are brands that, like you said, are behind closed doors that may agree or may not agree, that aren't saying why or why not. When that information comes to the surface, I think we get to a point where, I used this example earlier, having a conversation of the Montreal Protocol, where like it was a global effort to close up the ozone layer through, the reduction of using a product, chlorofluorocarbon, that was deteriorating the ozone layer, causing like skin cancer, things like that, also climate change. But like the effort was there from, activists and from companies, and then there was a clear through line per the scientists to say, hey, this is the one thing right here that we all can understand is destroying the economy or destroying our ozone layer, which would therefore kind of like, ripple effect through the, global scale. But collectively, there were solutions provided. Collectively, there was bigger organizations looking at it and saying, okay, we get it. The thing I see overall, there is a confusion. Everybody has their thing for climate change and they stand by it. I would call them the Bible thumpers. You heard me say this earlier, but they stand by it to the point where they can't hear or see other solutions or optional solutions in the space. So we get to a point where, they're screaming one thing in that corner, they're screaming another thing in that corner. And then, that guy over there is just eating up everything because they're like, whatever, and going to continue to do what they see fit. But if they can come together and then obviously present ideas that can get to more, better solutions, then I think we get to a point where we can have more movement. We've seen the SB 4 years ago. We've, the New York Fashion Act in recent, but we have more movement based on the fact that there are more people moving in the same direction. So it's like harder to stop. I mean, we protest a lot for a lot of things, but even in that, I see it as very, convoluted and kind of crosswire.
And I think we're running out of time, but I think that that's such a nice place to end, because what you're saying is essentially it's so piecemeal and siloed right now, and it's almost like what we need is a Green New Deal for fashion, or something that brings all of these disparate interests and causes together under some big policy umbrella.
I just leave one note. If any of you are interested in getting involved and you want to show up to lobby the Fashion Act, we are doing it on May 7th. There's a free bus from Soho, and if you are interested in coming and experiencing what it means to lobby for a bill, find me after this and you can join us, because it's an amazing experience and you'll get educated to understand the bill, and you can show up and actually support something that could change the industry.
And follow Remake to stay up to date and support the Fabric Act. All right, thank you guys.
All righty, with that, we've hit our lunchtime, so you got about an hour. Go out, get it. We have an awesome panel on profit, social materiality after lunch, so please come back at that time if you're interested. I swear it's going to be good.